start the recording. Okay, so session is now being recorded. Hello everyone. This is the third presentation of a seminar series on cognitive robotics organized by Queen Mary University of London and related also to the master module on cognitive robotics. And today I'm very happy to introduce Matej Hoffmann, who is currently professor at the Department of Cybernetics of the Czech Technical University in Prague. I've been knowing him for quite some time now, and I really like his research because I think is really in the flavor of cognitive robotics. So especially with this double objective of making smart robots, but also really understanding more about human behaviors and human development. And some of his research has also interesting connection with the psychologists who are working in child development. So I think this is a very interesting link. But also, I like the fact that the thing he has been working on, starting from this biological inspiration, then they have a quite important application in robotics and even like industrial robotics, so very applied things. So I think this makes his research extremely interesting. And yeah, without further ado, I will leave the floor to Matej, and thank you very much for being here.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Lorenzo, for the kind introduction. So let's get started. So I want to talk today about biologically inspired robot models and self-calibration. So what does that mean? Before we get onto that, just a little intro about basically my current group. So we are based in Prague and at the Czech Technical University. And I coordinate a group on humanoid and cognitive robotics. So yeah, below you see my group. Today, regarding the self-calibration, it will be mostly work of Karla Štěpánová and Jakub Rozlivek and Lukáš Rustler. So these guys here. Okay, so the lab, means people, and it also means robots. We're still waiting for our ICAP, that should have been delivered basically yesterday, but because of the pandemic situation, IIT requested 4 additional months, so we are waiting to receive it in June. So, and that is basically the platform that I worked on at IIT in Genoa, and it was sort of I think it's the ideal platform for cognitive developmental robotics. So we will be very eagerly waiting to receive that. We have also a Now robot, and since part of our research is about robots with artificial skins and also about whole body, basically sensitive skins, we brought our Now to IIT, and they put this ICAP skin onto the Now. So we have the only Now in the world that has the whole body skin, and in this case, unlike the ICAP, also on the face, which is important from a developmental perspective, because there's a lot of important touch on the face already when prenatally, like when babies are in the womb. We also do work on collaborative robotics, so we have a number of collaborative robots. So those are those robots that basically they don't have to be behind fences, but you can share the same physical space with them, like the UR10. In this case, with air skin, which is an industrial type of skin that basically protects you from the robot even more, because it's very sensitive and in a reliable way can stop the robot. We have a KUKA, LBR, IVA, and we have this also this Kinova arm. And one last collection of gadgets we have different hands and different grippers, because we have a project on interactive object manipulation. So basically learning about objects not through vision but through haptic exploration. So it's hard to see whether something is soft or whether something is, let's say, slippery from a camera, and that's where basically you need to start manipulating the object. And so that's so much for the overview. And this is a motivation slide that I often use that basically describes, I think, quite well my research in, let's say, the past at least 5 years. So I collaborate with psychologists, and we do experiments like this, what you see up there. So we're putting a little buzzer, which is like a vibrating little thing, like something like when your cell phone is on vibrator mode. And we attach it to babies at different body locations and at different ages, and we observe the reaction. So this baby here is about 8 months old. And you see that, so it's a sort of functional test of body knowledge. Basically, you need to localize something on your body, and you need to also reach for it. And here you see that at this age, the baby already performs well. And you see that there's a lot of things. There's coordination of both arms. There's also looking. So everything seems to be already learned at this point. And here you see something similar on the eye cup. So because it has this whole body skin, we basically tickle it on the forearm, and you see something similar behaviorally. So it looks there, and it goes and reaches there. And the only difference is that the brain probably does it differently than the eye cup. So in this case, for the eye cup, we basically used the engineering knowledge we have, and we programmed this behavior, okay? And now the challenge for my research is to basically throw away these engineered modules one by one and replace them with something brain-like, which on one hand will allow us to understand, because we don't know how the brain and how the babies learn about their bodies. And second, this would give rise to a, automatically self-calibrating robot, which would be a desired thing, because calibration of robots is still a pressing issue, because you normally need, external equipment, laser trackers, and it's cumbersome. So that's the motivation. And this is just another way of putting it, and I think Lorenzo already explained that this is what we call also the synthetic methodology. So we're somehow here in the middle. We're doing, we have humanoid robots, and we have some artificial brains, if you want. We have some neural networks, let's say. And now, on one hand, we do this synthetic modeling. So that means we're collaborating with neuroscientists and psychologists, and we make the robot, including its artificial brain, a model of some phenomenon that we observe, like, for example, how the babies reach for their bodies. And on the other hand, there is this kind of application side. So it happens that you create useful artifacts. So by exploring how babies learn their body models, you create robots that automatically calibrate themselves. So you create useful prototypes and possibly eventually applications. Today, I will focus basically on this part, mostly on this self-calibration. The same methodology is also applied, for example, to peripersonal space, which is somehow like a bubble of space that is represented by our brain, and that has a protective function. And that's another phenomenon that we study in this way, and that can then be applied basically for safe whole body awareness, and for collaborative robotics. So that's the methodology. So the motivation for us is that humans and animals are still so much better than robots in almost everything they do. Here you see a crow that is not only using tools, but it's also manufacturing tools. So it's basically adapting. You will see in a second that it basically creates on purpose. It makes a hook on that stick such that it can use it as a better to get out some food from the cavity. So tool use is one important thing, that you get a new tool, and first it's a body schema extension. It extends your body, but it's not just that. You also need to how to use that tool. So it's not easy, but animals and humans master it very well. That's something that we would like robots to also show. And as another motivation, here you see a collection of dogs that that were born without legs, for example, and still they adapt to that situation and they locomote, and so the degree of adaptation there is amazing. And again, that's a property that we would really like to see in our robot. This would give rise to resilient robots, and we are very far from that. And so the last motivation, this is what is called the Pinocchio illusion. So it happens that if you hold your nose and then somebody comes and basically vibrates your tendon on the triceps, it gives you an illusion that your triceps is elongating like this. But since you hold your nose, what actually, the way how this is processed by the brain typically is that you have this illusion of your nose extending. So I experienced this myself. It's really amazing. And it illustrates really how plastic or adaptive basically the brain is about how it represents the body. So if you imagine having a robot like the iCap and then basically tweaking one encoder, it's quite unlikely that the iCap will start thinking that its nose is elongating, right? But maybe that's why the robots are so limited and their adaptivity is limited. So that's for the motivation. Okay, so here I charted a couple of axes that characterizes body models. So basically body models in the brain and also in robots. So the robots would occupy, well, standard robots would occupy one corner here. And so this is a robot, it's a manipulator, and this is one of its models. In this case, it's forward kinematics, okay? So you're mapping from the joint space to the Cartesian space, where your end effector is in the Cartesian space, for which you need the actual joint angles, and you need a model, which in this case basically are the links and their lengths, like this A1, A2, A3, and the orientations of the joints. And this together, you just plug it into this simple trigonometry equation, and you get the coordinates of the end effector. So this model would be fixed because typically there's a model that comes with the robot, and it remains like that for the robot's lifetime. Explicit because there's a clear correspondence between, here you see this A3 and the same in the model. So there is a one-to-one correspondence between the symbols in the model and in reality. So in this sense, we call it explicit. And it's amodal or unimodal, meaning that it relies just on one sensory modality. So unimodal in this case, which are the joint angles. Now, if you look at humans and their brains, it would fall into the exact opposite corner on all these axes, actually. So adaptive or plastic, the brains are famous for that. Multisensorial or multimodal, because there's a whole set of modalities involved. So in this case, for the body, it would be proprioception, it would be touch, it would be vision, it would be vestibular inputs. It would be also auditory inputs, so it's highly multimodal, and it's implicit in the sense that it would be really hard to find a neuron that represents the length of your forearm, right? So in that sense, it would be, we would call it implicit. Okay, and so now my research is about bringing the robot body models more toward the brain-like body models for two reasons. One is that we don't understand the mechanisms of how the brain represents the body. So we through the robots and the artificial brains, we create embodied computational models. And second, because that was the motivation we discussed. We would like robots to perform better in terms of autonomy, robustness, and safety. So robot body models, the typical ones, like the one you see you see here, are typically fixed, centralized, explicit, and rely on minimum sensory info information and start from significant prior knowledge. So in that case, calibration is more like fine-tuning of parameters, okay? Because the structure and is already given, and you're just fine-tuning some parameters if there is calibration. And calibration itself is not performed automatically or autonomously by the robot, but instead you typically need some external metrology, which means like you bring a laser tracker, an expensive device that is highly accurate, but also highly expensive, and you basically need to collect data and calibrate. And then as soon as something changes, wear and tear, or you add a new tool, you are basically you need to do this again, which is not convenient. So now I will give you an overview of a couple of case studies that we did in this direction. This was the first one that we did back at IIT with Alessandro Roncone and Ugo Patacini and Giorgio Metta, so it's the same video that you have already seen. And so what happens here is that you can use this scenario for exactly for this self-calibration, because the skin has been calibrated before, so you know wherever we call them taxels, these individual tactile sensors. There's about 4,000 of them on the whole robot body, and so you know where they are with respect to some local reference frame. And now if I touch like this, you see it on the left side, you can basically close the kinematic chain. And in this case, let's say the right finger, the right finger is touching a particular taxel, and you can do forward kinematics for the right finger and localize it in 3D space. You can do the same for the activated sensor on the left hand. And it's likely that you will have some kind of mismatch, right? Small or big. But this mismatch of these two positions in 3D will give you an error term that you can optimize, and you can optimize the robot model such that you minimize this error term, this discrepancy. How the robot is represented? It's represented using the standard Danavid-Hardenberg parameters. So every link is represented by 4 parameters. So we're talking about 3 positions and 3 orientations in 3D space, which would be 6 parameters, but this Danavid-Hardenberg Danavid-Hardenberg convention that applies to robots is more parsimonious. You need only 4 parameters, which, if you're calibrating something, of course, is convenient because you have fewer parameters to calibrate. Now, to achieve touch, the one way of doing that would be to treat every arm separately, but that's not the best solution, because you would first have to think where they should meet, and then you would send independently the left arm there and then the right arm there. But that's not the best solution, because you actually which parts of the reachable space are convenient for that. So what we did instead was to reformulate the 2 kinematic chains into one. So basically reversing one part of the chain and making it a floating based chain from where you want to get the contact to the end effector on the other arm. And for this, basically, you can use an inverse kinematics solver on one chain, which is much more convenient. Now, how do you formulate the self-calibration problem? So we're optimizing the parameter vector, which consists of n links, and on every link you have those 4 Danavid-Hardenberg parameters. In our case, we have 12 links, so 5 on the, let's say, on the arm to be touched, and 7 on the touching, because it goes all the way up to the finger. And yeah, this is another way of visualizing the thing. So this is the finger, and this is basically from the wrist frame of reference to the surface of the skin where the robot is being touched. And so how do you formalize the optimization problem? So this is what I already introduced in the beginning. So you have an error term here. So this is the position of the end effector, and this is the position of the skin. Now these positions are dependent on the parameters, which is the kinematic kinematic chain, and on the current joint angles. So basically you have all these different self-contact configurations. You have M of them. In each of those configurations, you need to feed in the joint angles. And given the current parameter estimate, which is the robot body model, it gives an error function. It gives an actual error value, and you optimize the parameters such that you achieve the optimum parameters that minimize, for the sum of all the data points that you collected, that they minimize the error. And yeah, you can use an optimizer for that. For some reason, we use this nonlinear least squares. So we use this IPOP, which is a library for nonlinear optimization. In other words, we used different algorithms. It's nonlinear because of the kinematics, right? So you have seen the formula for forward kinematics. It has sines and cosines. So it is nonlinear. It's not highly nonlinear, and that's why most people actually use algorithms, nonlinear, iterative nonlinear least squares algorithms that basically linearize the function locally, like the Levenberg-Marquardt algorithm or the Gauss-Newton. Okay, and what you see here is the opposite situation. So as we got our now with the fresh skin, we didn't know where the individual taxels are. We didn't know the location in space of the sensors on the robot body. So what we did here was the exact opposite. So we used the forward kinematics of the now to spatially calibrate the skin. So you see the robot again performing self-contact, and from the forward kinematics, we were localizing the sensors. In this case, it's more complicated because you have basically this double touch. You have activations on two points in space, but in case you don't have any of them calibrated, the minimization problem is more complicated. But it's possible. So this just illustrates the problem. So here is basically the covers where the skin will be mounted. This is the skin for which the 2D arrangement is known, but it's flexible. So the 3D arrangement is not known as you glue it onto the robot, and you don't know where it's exactly glued. So this is the starting point. So you can use this kind of CAD-based modeling, but then to do the fine-tuning, how it is exactly glued. So for example, you see here that it doesn't really respect the layout that was designed on the 3D printed part. So for that, basically, you can do this fine calibration using the self-contact. So in this paper, which is under review now, we empirically compared different ways. So how this CAD-based calibration can be combined with self-contact. Two types of self-contact, actually. One, that without any additional device, so basically directly skin on skin. And the other is here, which is using an artificial finger that we mounted onto the wrist, which makes it more accurate because the contact is more localized. And also you can basically use directly forward kinematics, plus you need to calibrate the finger, but it's a simpler problem than when you have this double touch and you don't know the positions for both of the skin parts. Okay, and the third component that we did and compared was 3D reconstruction. So we uncovered the sensors. So by removing the top black part, we took the robot outside to get nice lighting conditions. We took several pictures of the robot, and using some software for 3D reconstruction, we got basically a point cloud with the positions of the individual sensors in 3D, which was locally very accurate. But then you still don't know how it you need to relate it to the robot body model, which is the kinematics. And for that, basically, we also explored how this can be combined with the self-contact calibration to really get the best performance. So in this article, we compared independently these methods: card-based calibration, 3D reconstruction, and these two types of self-contact. And if locally, the best is the 3D reconstruction, but the self-contact can help you to actually locate it with respect to the body model. But if you don't do 3D reconstruction, you can still perform reasonably well just with self-contact, but you're not as accurate. So this is like a practical example. We got a robot, we didn't know where the skin is located, and here we explore the different possibilities what you can do such that you get the locations for all the, in this case, 1,000 taxels on the robot. Okay, so we talked about self-contact. The other possibility, how you can basically close the loop, how you can connect. You always need to connect more than one kinematic chain. You need redundant information for you to learn, for you to have something to minimize. And the alternative is to use what is called self-observation, which is rather than touching, you look. So either you have a marker and you look at the marker on your let's say wrist, or so this is work by Lorenzo Iamone and colleagues, where on the iCap they didn't use a marker, but they basically detected the hand in the image. And using an architecture that is shown here, so Lorenzo, of course, knows the details better than me. They could calibrate the robot. In this case, I think this was the joint offsets being calibrated online as the robot was looking at its arms or hands. And another piece of work in this direction is where we combined these two modes of calibration, so self-contact and self-observation. This was just work in the simulator, but we had the iCap basically do these self-contact configurations in the reachable space, and at the same time it was looking at the point of contact. And what we analyzed here is, we wanted to compare the two methods and also study the synergies. If the two are combined, are you getting even better results? So what you see here is basically where the robot was performing the self-contacts in the, so this is a MATLAB model of the robot. These are the arms, this is the torso and the head. And here you see the statistics of the individual joints distributions in this data set. So this is something that is actually important, because if you want to calibrate kinematics, you need to basically have the best possible distribution of every joint, because if a distribution of some joint is narrow, like for instance this, then it makes it hard to calibrate. Okay, and so again, there was the Navid-Hartenberg convention for the arm kinematic chains, for the eye kinematic. So these are the arm kinematic chains. There's a common root reference frame. Then you can go to every arm. And then there is another chain going up and to the individual eyes. And this is the eye kinematic chain. The left eye kinematic chain and the right eye is the same. It just has these last two links different. And the error function, here is the part for the self-contact. So these are the Cartesian positions of the left and right arm, and they are touching. So that's something you want to minimize. But in addition, in the same objective function, we're also using projections of this point into the cameras. And from the forward kinematics, you can compute where, let's say, the finger should appear in the camera. And then you have the actual reading on that camera, in this case, or from the camera, in this case, in the simulator, and that gives you another error term. And because you have two cameras and two arms, you get 4 error terms, which you can all add together. Some scaling factors are necessary, because in this case you're dealing with meters, in this case you're dealing with pixels, so that's something that you need to account for, but you can basically combine all these together. And so for the results, I don't want to go into the details, but basically what we found is that there is a synergetic effect. So if you use both modalities at once, the calibration results are better, and also observability is better. So observability is something that expresses, so there is this error function that relates the error of the function you're optimizing with the parameters. The partial derivative with respect to individual parameters is this Jacobian, and the properties of this matrix, for example, the rank of this matrix are summarized with this observability index. The higher the observability index, the better, because it allows you to basically, so it has a higher rank, let's say, this matrix, and so that's best for optimization. Okay, so here you see how the error function is optimized, but of course you're calibrating the parameters, so the DH parameters, and so one thing is you're minimizing this end effector error, which actually being optimizing, and the other thing is that you're correcting those parameters, and you can also visualize the corrections that you're making on the actual parameters. So you can basically compare the model of the robot before and after, and you can study the properties of this optimization problem. Okay, and then as another example to sort of also go toward industrial robotics, we did a similar scenario in industrial robots. So this is a Yaskawa Motoman, a dual arm. It's a big robot. And so we made it into a sort of humanoid by attaching 2 cameras like this. And then we also made it do self-contact. And in addition, we put markers such that it can do the self-observation. And so we basically replicated the scenario on an industrial robot. And I will not go into the details, but we observed the same thing. So there is basically this synergy that if you combine multiple methods, one additional method can be a planar constraint. So you're touching the table here, and you know it's a plane, and all these things can be combined together, which is presumably also what the brain is using, but very likely it's not using the same algorithm that we are using here. So that will be the next challenge. And yeah, so here you see just everything in one spot, all the different case studies that we basically now completed. And because there was a lot of work of the same kind, we also developed a toolbox for MATLAB for multi-robot calibration or multisensorial calibration, which you are welcome to check and to use, and we can also support you in using that. Okay, so that was the collection of the self-calibration case studies, and coming back to the axis that we charted before. So the standard ICAP model is here. So this is the Navid-Hattenberg representation, and it's fixed, and it's, let's say, unisensorial or unimodal. Here is an example of what we just talked about. So this would be this multi-chain calibration, in this case using proprioception from the joint angles, touch from the skin, and vision. So 3 modalities. So we make, let's say, we put it up here on this axis, and it's adaptive because that's how we design. So it's calibrating itself. Still, of course, it's really far from the adaptivity or plasticity that we observe in the brain, right? It's very constrained. So the structure is given. There are bounds on the model, and it would never fall for something like the Pinocchio illusion. So the adaptability is still modest in a way. Okay. There are some models in the literature, like for example, Josh Bongard's this starfish robot that you could break off its leg and it would find an alternative model. So this would be more adaptive in that sense, but still less than the brain. And here is just a collection of also some deep learning models, which are also quite adaptive because they are black box and they are not constrained by the structure that was invented by an engineer. I mean, they have also other disadvantages, but they have this potential for high adaptivity that is for sure. And we will look into the details in a little bit. And here are some other axes that we can look at. This would be modular versus end-to-end or holistic, and centralized and universal versus distributed and specialized. So what does it mean? So we normally assume that the body models or the robot body models are centralized, and because they are in one let's say place, there's only one model, and also universal, which means that basically that one model is used for every task that the robot performs. Okay. However, centralized is different than modular. So it is there just one model, but still it's modular because we would have a separate model for kinematics, for dynamics, and that's a convenient property. So we would have these modules that are still universal. So whenever you need to use kinematics, you would use that model, but it will still be modular because you would have a module for kinematics and you would have a sub-module for the leg kinematics and for the arm kinematics. For the brain, this would be different. So brain representations are known to be distributed and specialized. However, the brain is not at the complete opposite of the axis here, which is interesting now, because, for example, the deep learning models would be even more specialized because they are typically trained to do one task, and if you need another task, you train a different network, and that is probably something that the brain cannot afford because it would not scale in this way. And that's why in the brain, you do have areas that actually specialize on something, like on the representation of hand in space. And that representation of hand in space would be used in different tasks. So in that case, it would be less specialized than these deep learning models. Octopus is here because octopus we would expect it to be even more distributed, and because basically, for example, in the octopus there is a central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, but in the central nervous system no body representations were found because all the functionality is basically distributed also to the peripheral nervous system, but also to the body itself. Which leads us also to the last set of axes. So whether the representations are explicit or implicit, or also embodied. So in this case, the octopus would really rely on the properties of this muscular hydrostat, and it may not even know where its hand in space is, but it may actually not need to know, because what is understood about the octopus is it basically just sends out a wave such that the arm extends in the direction of the prey, but then the rest is basically on the local mechanisms as soon as you receive feedback when it touches the prey. And veridical is something that whether it's true. So we basically, for us, it's natural to think that the robot model should describe reality. So the geometry of the robot, you come with the ruler, and that's what it should also appear in the model. But in biology, this is not really necessary, because the only criterion for success is whether the representations are good for successful action in the world. But whether it's really they represent, the true dimensions of something is not a necessity. And body representations can be split into body schema and body image. And the body schema would be more for action, the sensorimotor part, which would have slightly different properties than body image, which is more like a high-level representation, like how you see your body, for example. And this is to explain the last axis there, which was this serial and parallel and recurrent. So typically processing with robots in the body model and in other models would be serial, while in the, which would be something like this, you have an input, vision, process, cognitive processes, planning, execution, movement. While in the brain, this is a diagram from this book that is cited down here. It would be more like you have a multiple candidate action specifications, and you would have some biasing factors, and only one would eventually win, but all the others were in place. And this is possibly a reason why we are also so flexible and resilient, because there's always alternatives in place, which is not the case for robots. If something blocks the trajectory of a robot, you cannot. It often gets stuck. This case study is of the kind where we really want to develop something that is like the brain, and in this case, we wanted to have this somatosensory homunculus for the eye cup. So these homunculi you must have seen. These are parts of the brain where your body is represented. This somatosensory one basically represents the surface of your skin. It has this, famous distorted representation, because some areas get basically bigger, are magnified, like where the density of tactile receptors is big. And so we wanted to do the same for the eye cap, and we wanted to have also the same ordering of the parts in, let's say, the eye cap's homunculus. So we designed an algorithm that is like the self-organizing map, but with additional constraints, which is playing sort of the role of genetics, because in the brain is also like that. In every brain of every individual, the gross layout of the somatotopy would be the same. So we modified the SOAP algorithm to force it to have this gross layout, and then the details were learned. So here it's me basically going around the eye cup with my thumb, and my thumb is as big as about 7 taxels to activate them at the same time. And so from these local co-activations, the model learned to represent the details, which taxel is next to which. And since there is this gap in the skin between where the shoulder joint is, I have to also do basically something like that, such that I can connect these two parts. So if you learned with a standard SOM, then every run you would learn a different somatotopy, and that's why we did this MRF SOM, which is maximum receptive field size setting SOM, that we basically constrain the maximum receptive fields of each part of the SOM, such that we have always the gross layout the same, but the details are from experience. Yeah, here you see the receptive fields of the individual neurons in the SOM, the part representing the torso. So basically this neuron learned to represent this part of the torso, this neuron, this part of the torso, and then you see that this somatotopy, the neighborhood relationships, are preserved. Okay, and so I think in the interest of time, I will not go into the details of body maps in the brain. And yeah, these are the experiments that we perform with the infant, that they reach for the buzzers, okay? And just to explain in a nutshell, so you see here the same baby and at the age of 6 months and at the age of almost 9 months, and there is a striking difference. So here, basically, it seems that it is aware of the stimulus, but we don't know how to reach for it. While on the other side, you see this highly coordinated action. So in those 3 months, something critical must have happened, that the brain learned about the body, and that's something that we would like to understand also using the humanoid robots with artificial skin. By now we have performed a lot of studies, so we tested basically 150 or more infants cross-sectionally or longitudinally. The results are that there is basically this functional body map, if you want, is filling up. It's different for different locations, so some parts are easier to reach for the baby than other body parts, the elbow being the most difficult. but basically the success rate goes up in this critical period, basically in the first 2 months of the infant's life. And we're also analyzing the kinematics now, so we would like to basically better understand the mechanisms. Also, redundancy of the motor system is important. So does the baby always reach this, use the same posture to reach, or is it different, or is it somehow constructed on the run? So these are things that we now have data for, but that we need to analyze to be able to understand. So this I will skip. There are neural correlates, of course. There are these somatotopic body maps. Then there are in the associative cortices, like in the posterior parietal cortex, it's all somehow put together. Then there is the somatotopy is fractured, but it's basically, it should be the body in space, and that's somehow the mystery. This is one particular study of Sakata and colleagues where they found self-touch neurons, so neurons that specifically respond in the monkey's brain for these kind of configurations where there is self-contact. Okay, so to conclude, there's a lot of bio-inspired body models. The question is now, which of them would make good technology and why? And in our particular case, regarding body models, so humans and animals are still so much better, that's clear, but not all the characteristics of their operation will be adopted by engineers anytime soon. So for example, for the body models, we have adaptive, multimodal, implicit, distributed. Yeah, which of them you think will be first embraced by engineers and which will maybe be never embraced? Or we can, since I'm almost at the end, maybe we can leave it to the discussion. But my guess is the following. So of course we want models to be adaptive. It's already happening. Multimodal, it's basically starting because robots tend to have more and more sensors on board. But some of the properties like implicit or distributed are really hard for engineers, right? Because for example, if you have something modular like a software library for kinematics and another one for dynamics, you can nicely maintain, and that's basically software development principles that you shouldn't have two things at the same implemented in multiple places, right? But for the brain, it doesn't seem to respect that property, and maybe that's why it's eventually so resilient. Yeah, implicit is another inconvenient property for engineers, but yeah, there may be good reasons why the brain is using that. And yeah, that concludes my talk, and thank you for the attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matej. I think it was really interesting. Right, so we opened the floor to question. There was a lot of material, so but if there are any questions, please type them on the chat, and then I will post them, or you can also just speak by yourself. I think unless you need the screen, you can stop your sharing maybe.
Mm-hmm.
So that
okay, I'll try.
There should be like a stop button.
Stop button. Let's see. Yeah, I see it. Okay, yeah. I just stopped it.
This should be all right. Okay, thanks. I maybe start from well, I will have several questions, also comments, but maybe let's see where to start. Well, maybe just a quick comment on the very last thing you said about the software development. I think this is very interesting because, especially when I teach to students cognitive robotics, but also advanced robotics, I actually tell them a lot about how big, let's say, software projects for robots to do complex things. It's a big software engineering project typically, and so we should try to follow those principles of, for example, the not having too much redundancy, but independence of one model doing one thing and another model doing another thing, right? So it's interesting that you mentioned this, because it's true that probably the brain does things differently, but it's hard to balance that with the engineering realization. So I think that's very interesting comment. that you made. But okay, maybe one question about, so you mentioned this implicit property, right? Therefore, do you have, I mean, I get that in general, but do you have evidence that, for example, in the brain, you or from looking at studies, that in the brain there is no explicit representation, for example, of the length of our forearm? Like, I don't know. Is it something, is a kind of proven, or is just an intuition?
Yeah, it's probably rather an intuition. I mean, but it's like, you know, all these grandmother cells, right? That if there is a neuron for Jennifer Aniston in the brain, I mean, sometimes people find these kind of, you know, strange grandmother cells, but I think that in general, it's unlikely that it would function like that. And the fact that people, for example, you know, analyzing motor cortex still don't know whether what is actually represented, you know, whether it's joint space or whether it's forces or whether it's Cartesian space. And every new experiment, you know, finds different tuning of the neurons. So it seems to be that it really is not that there would be a clear explicit representation of almost anything.
Yeah. And probably the other one is that maybe there is more than one representation for the same thing, right? So, and this is related, I mean, you mentioned that also in the brain there are, let's say, hierarchies or reuse of components, right? And you made the distinction between, for example, end-to-end learning system in which you learn for a specific task, but then you don't really know how to reuse maybe internal components, while the brain clearly does that. But it's also true that probably there are more than one representation for the same thing, right? So can we assume that, for example, in the brain there is not one representation of the kinematics of the body, but more than one?
I mean, these are all, I think, tough questions, and the part dealing with this, like this posterior parietal cortex, is still quite a mystery even to neuroscientists. So the brain is definitely, and that's what I try to show on those axes. I don't think the brain can afford to be, you know, like that it has a deep, let's say, end-to-end network for everything, because there's just no way, it just doesn't scale. So that's why there are these areas that are specialized on something and that are reused in multiple tasks. So in that case, it's not, you know, as extreme, but it's probably somewhere in between, and that's probably also why it's so good, because the fact that it has also these, you know, multiple alternatives, that's why it is not brittle, right? Of course, it's a mess and nobody understands, but maybe that's a possibility where we should go with the robots, but the engineers would never accept this, so I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard. Yeah, and the other, let's say, well, I'm going on asking you a question, but so the related thing is, so for example, in going a bit closer to your experiments, for example, the one that you have in the Now robot, in which you calibrate the locations of the skin, starting from the kinematics. And as you said, like you start with some tentative locations, right? And then you fine tune those locations with the learning, with the exploration. So do you think, for example, is something similar happening in the child, that they are already born with some, let's say, tentative location of their sensory receptors in the body, and then they fine tune, or it's more of a from scratch or almost from scratch?
Right. So for the, let's say, tactile homunculus, for the somatosensory cortex, the basic structure seems to be there in a newborn. Especially for the tactile cortex, for the proprioceptive, it's less developed. It's sort of still dramatically, also in monkeys, it dramatically develops. But so the fact that you have this somatotopy in the tactile homunculus is one thing, but it's also, Kevin O'Regan likes to point out, this doesn't mean that you actually know where the things are, because you need to connect it to the rest. So this is this principle of these somatosensory contingencies, that only once you connect it up with the actions, then it actually has a meaning, that you know where it is. Because the fact that it lights up in a particular location in that tactile map, it's fine, but doesn't really mean anything. So the challenge is really what I think we're seeing also in these experiments with the buzzers, that, you know, there's the localization, but it's not a passive thing. There has to be this action, and that's why it's so difficult to model.
Yeah. Yeah, I will have more question about that as well, but there is also a question from the floor on the multimodal self-calibration that you've done, whether you were considering visual self-occlusions or not, and if you were dealing with that in any ways.
No. So on the simulated iCap, we just sidestepped that, and on the industrial robot, on the Motoman, we basically, I think, as we selected the configurations, well, that's why we there use this icosahedron, this thing with the 20 markers, to make sure that some of them are always visible. And I think configurations that would self-occlude, I think we just discarded them because, yeah, so we discarded them.
But yeah, having the multiple markers at least alleviate the problem in general, that you're more robust to the self-occlusion. It's hard that you have a complete self-occlusion. Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, another comment from the floor is about the fact that some structure are present from birth in the brain, like in the form of instinct or let's say a predefined structure. And the example is where like animal that can already walk very soon after they are born. I guess this is different in the different species. I don't know if you want to have a quick comment on that.
It seems that in the human brain, so yeah, humans are special that they basically like to learn a lot of the things. So that's why the human babies are so basically incompetent. And that's for a reason, because then probably what they eventually learn becomes more versatile. And but it has to be done, and it takes a lot of time, and it needs a lot of experience. Yeah. And that's something that we cannot afford usually with the robots, because they break before they get there.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and maybe still on the, let's say, the work you have with the now, just as an example, but maybe the question can be even more general. So even when you start with this tentative location, then you need to touch around in order to fine-tune that representation. Were you using some special strategy to decide where to touch, or was it let's say extensive search over the space?
Yeah, so I mean, in self-calibration, people do research on this pose selection. You can basically choose the optimal poses, for example, to maximize the observability. But we haven't done that yet. So we basically did something like a grid search, or we just basically covered. One thing we do pay attention to is the distribution of the joints, because that's necessary. You need to basically have enough. Basically, you need to excite every degree of freedom such that you can calibrate it. So that we paid attention to, but we didn't have a specific post selection algorithm.
Yeah. So you had, let's say, a kind of a desired distribution in the joint space that you were trying to follow. Yeah, makes sense. And yeah, I mean, you just mentioned like this buzzer experiment, which is also very interesting. You show the difference in the child from like 6 months to 8 months. You see, okay, in that period of time there are some crucial things happening, right? Which are not necessarily related to the general ability to reach, because I think in general, as in around 4 or 5 months, the child's already relatively good at reaching for objects. Of course, this develops then until that 8 or 9 months, which is clearly like a crucial period. But already like 4 or 5 months, the child they're relatively good at, they show a lot of successful reaching. While in your case, at 6 months, it was almost nothing happening, right?
Yes, but it depends on the body location. So those on the limbs are more difficult, which is presumably also because they are more difficult to localize, because you need to know where your limb is in space. But we do have reactions, for example, on the above the mouth already at 3 months of age. They already grab it, and on the torso they grab it at 4 months. So that's somehow intertwined, with as reaching develops. So right. It's a major challenge. I would like to understand, how these two basically reaching for external objects and reaching for own body, how these two are intertwined. And we have basically now data that we would like to analyze, and yeah, but it's a major challenge.
Okay, yeah, it's very interesting. And did you see also differences, for example, on either reaching on the say opposite elbow or reaching on the opposite hand? Were there differences there or not?
Yeah, so we had, I think, the hand location. We also had forearm and crook of elbow and elbow, and I think these develop around, let's say, those 6-7 months of age. And the elbow is definitely the most difficult because, well, first, it's also not very visible, and second, it requires this coordinated action of the other arm, what you see that baby doing, and that takes a lot of time to develop. So it's basically, it's really doing, a beautiful inverse kinematics, or robotics speaking.
Right.
But how, that's that's the challenge.
Yeah, because that one is not just moving one arm, but you have to move the other one in a coordinated way. So yeah, it's
Exactly.
challenging. I see. Yeah. Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think we can maybe close here. I will have some more comments, but I think maybe just a quick, not much of a question, but more of a comment, and also for the students of cognitive robotics, they will see that many of these things we touched upon also during the lectures, and I especially like also another comment that you made about the fact whether the representation should be veridical or not. Right, and I think this relates, at least in my mind, to the fact that in biological systems, sometimes the brain representations, the best brain representation is the one that will allow the agent to survive in the environment, right? Which is not necessarily something that, so reality is sometimes not what we see, but it can be represented in a different way by the brain that is more effective. And we see this in several, let's say, also illusions or mistakes that human or other animals may do. So yeah, I think that was also a very interesting comment for me. Okay, this being said, thank you so much, Matej. It was really good.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation.
I will stop the recording now, and we close this session. So thanks also everyone for attending and for asking questions, and this of course will be available later on for people to watch it.